dimension, attempt to transform state institutions so that they would promote and express gender justice. Finally, Fraser claims that secular feminism attempted to globalise sisterhood, although she argues that this functioned more of an abstract gesture than anything else. Okay, so the depressing bit. How did these new forms of post-war capitalism come to take some of those feminist critiques, second-wave critiques, to undermine them and to assimilate elements of this project? Right. So this is the next section. Okay, so after the dismantling of key elements of the Bretton Woods Agreement, came the era that we all know so well, right? The era that we're living through now: privatisation, deregulation, the destruction of the public sphere, attacks on welfare, the ideological promotion of individualism, competition. Obviously, in Britain and elsewhere, we're in the very fierce grips of austerity measures, absolute destruction of all of these things, particularly the public sphere. In Britain, in the past 6 months, this has been very, very visible and very obvious and very fast. These kind of brutal destruction of welfare state, right? So, and the privatisation and franchising of anything that's left, basically. Okay, so this vicious side of the new form of capitalism, let's say, which is of course unevenly executed across East and Western Europe, and, quote, at the gunpoint of debt in the developing world, right? So in terms of structural adjustment and so on, right? So it's not clear that this happened, in the same way everywhere, right? It's an obvious thing to say. I mean, think about David Harvey's idea of accumulation by dispossession as well. So the way in which, whatever we want to call it, neoliberalism, there will be lots of debate about whether we should call it neoliberalism or whatever. I think that the interesting question for me here is about speed, right? So what is the different speeds at which these things are executed, and who executes them, the role of the IMF and so on. Okay, the most contentious part of Fraser's argument about second-wave feminism, though, is her suggestion that it in fact thrived in these new conditions, right? So she's saying that in a way second-wave feminism and neoliberalism kind of helped each other, really, which is a very striking thing for a feminist to claim in some ways, right? So she says that its ideas and critiques reached across class, ethnicity, political ideology to, quote, ultimately reshape common sense views of family, work and dignity. She asks, was there some perverse subterranean elective affinity between second-wave feminism and neoliberalism? And as Eisenstein similarly puts it in Feminism Seduced, the ideology of 21st century feminism lends itself to the principles behind globalization. Okay. So, how do we do this? Fraser sets up a series of heretical hypotheses. She says that perhaps feminist anti-economist claims for justice became calls for the recognition of identity and difference at the expense of class. Okay, so that the old Marxist or class-based focus on injustice became sort of swallowed up and obscured by debates about identity and difference, and certainly we can see this happening in the academy. So people often, particularly after 1989, wanting to turn their back on Marxism and anything to do with what they saw as a failed project, often turn to debates about identity and difference, without really talking about class anymore. And she said this is reflected in a kind of turn to cultural rather than social theory, so no longer a commitment to the idea of society. Think about Thatcher's famous claim that there is no such thing as society, there are only families, individuals and their families, is the quote. We have an ironic attempt by the Conservative Party in Britain to reclaim society, right? We have their idea of the big society, which doesn't really mean anything other than they get to do whatever they want, but they're trying to make up for Thatcher's open admission, in a sense. They're trying to say, no, there is still a society, we're just destroying it, but we're going to call it big society for some reason. But at least sort of in terms of the academy, this turns to culture rather than society, right, which we saw particularly in the 90s, I think. She says this timing could not have been worse, in a sense, right? So this turn to identity and difference politics. And that, in fact, capitalism, in relation to the critique of hierarchy and technocratic organisation, she says that capitalism took on some of feminism's critique of the supposedly inflexible androcentric model in favour of a new connectionist project capitalism in which rigid organisational hierarchies will give way to horizontal teams and flexible networks. So in a way she's saying the very structure of feminist opposition and their critique, performative practical critique of, top-heavy, top-down structures was just immediately assimilated by capitalism in terms of the way it organised itself. So, decentering, right the way through into workplaces to global structures. I think we see this, at least, it's very useful for capitalism to no longer have kind of central headquarters for industry and so on. It's much easier if it's deracinated in some ways, even if the money will, of course, flow back to the top, right? The mass inclusion of women into the workforce at the top, well, not really, the middle and bottom mainly, as a partial result of the critique of the image of the male breadwinner, means that ultimately, for Fraser, quote, the dream of women's emancipation is harnessed to the engine of capitalist accumulation. Right. So again, this idea that the influx of women into the workplace turned out to be very handy for capitalism and much less for the advantage or benefit of women themselves, or their families. And again, in the ideology of work, I promise I'm not going to go on about it, otherwise something else will fall down. We have this strange situation, just reflecting on the British situation, where everyone is somehow forced to think of themselves as workers, to feel incredibly depressed if they don't have a job, for example, and you have very, very punitive, often psychic and psychological mechanisms that is approved of by the government, so cognitive behavioural therapy. So if you're depressed and you go to the doctor, you say, I don't have a job, I feel very bad about myself. They will use CBT as a way of encouraging you to sort of think of yourself as a worker, and it's basically government-approved kind of brainwashing. It's absolutely horrific. So rather than addressing any kind of deeper structural problems or personal problems, you just have this kind of, no, we've got to get you back into work, even when there isn't really any work, right? So huge unemployment, not as big as in some other countries, but getting there very fast, and huge youth unemployment as well. So, you have this sort of, endless kind of attempts to push work as the kind of the only real form of value, human value. Fraser concludes her sort of synopsis with reference to what she calls the uncanny double of feminism and what Angela McRobbie calls faux feminism. It's not at all, she argues, that second-wave feminism has failed or is directly responsible for neoliberalism, but rather that feminism needs to become much more self-aware about the way in which it can and has been resignified. And I think this is interesting use of that resignification. So what does it mean when terms like feminism, freedom, gender, so on get resignified in the name of a neoliberal capitalist project? In an interview around the time of this article, she states that, quote, feminist ideas have become so broadly disseminated that they have become part of common sense. Just about everyone claims to be a feminist now, but what does that mean? Okay, and she has a point. I mean, in the short polemic I wrote, I reflected on the fact that Sarah Palin describes herself as a feminist, but is not feminist by any, of the standards that we would usually associate with this position, right? She's anti-abortion, she's just horrific to other women. There's nothing. It's very strange. It's kind of there's a way in which feminism, as a term, is often evacuated of precisely its political, economic, and social content, because, in a way, as Fraser demonstrates, that these strands have been totally fragmented and split apart from one another. So that, in a way, if you say, well, look, I believe in strong women getting top jobs, right? Therefore, I'm a feminist. Okay, but at the same time, if all that means is, you end up with Margaret Thatcher, then we have this huge problem. But about this kind of, the sort of widespread, again, sort of superficial acceptance of feminism as a discourse. Eisenstein describes it as hegemonic feminism, and McRobbie, as I said, talks about faux feminism, but also post-feminism, which she says positively draws upon and invokes feminism as that which can be taken into account to suggest that equality is achieved, in order to install really a whole repertoire of new meaning which emphasises it is no longer needed, it is a spent force. So, I mean, probably there's a kind of slightly dialectical way in which certain feminist postures, ideas, theories, and so on are, openly discussed, described, enjoyed, but precisely as a way of warding off feminism as a serious political project, right? So, again, it may be this idea of kind of individual emancipation, or economic emancipation in the sense that one can spend money on consumer goods and so on, but totally, hiding any kind of larger structural critique of androcentrism, capitalism, and so on. Okay, Fraser suggests as a positive way, out of the haunting by this uncanny double of fake feminism, several shifts. She says that we need to reassert an image of the social totality, which is an interesting claim, by reconnecting feminist critique to the critique of capitalism. And lots of people have been suggesting this in recent years, that in a way, how do you put feminism back together with some of its original projects? Well, it has to be part of a bigger critique of capitalism, which would definitively and politically put feminism back on the left. And I think in recent years, again, the Sarah Palin is a sort of obscene example, but the idea that feminism is so broad that it's a multi-political spectrum idea has been quite prevalent, right? So you have right-wing people saying, yes, of course I'm a feminist, right? So she said that we need an image of the social totality, right? Not a cultural sort of description of feminism. She says we need to promote forms of life that de-centre wage work, I completely agree, and valorise uncommodified activities such as care work, although I think this claim is problematic, and obviously many of the discussions in the 1970s about the definition of work were precisely what counts as work, so whether housework is work, whether looking after children is work. And I think, in a way, without wanting to resolve that question, I think that debate, in a sense, needs to be brought back, but also more than that, I'm very interested in the way in which certain forms of labour, so care work, emotional labour, to say basically the capacity to be nice, to be human, is exploited in many forms of jobs. Okay, it's always been the case, right? Mm-hmm. But I think we've got to have a sort of much more complicated image of what work is, and the kind of physical and mental toll it takes, and the various forms of exploitation that it involves, not simply one's time, but a kind of the way in which it particular work plays upon, will sort of steal your emotions and your humanity from you in certain ways. And one of my favourite examples is of air hostesses for a Singapore airline company who were so tired of being sexually harassed and wanted better pay and better conditions that they went on a smile strike. And I love this image of a way of resisting the demand to be a perky worker, to be happy, to, and often it's very feminized, right? So you have, the air hostess is the classic example, of course, of, the sort of sexualized, happy to serve female, who, will do whatever you want, even if you're some horrible, fat, drunk businessman, disgusting, she has to, be nice and calm. And so the idea of the smile strike, I find just a very nice example of what it might mean to sort of refuse certain forms of emotional labour. And obviously the question of emotional labour, I might talk more about this tomorrow if people are interested, but it's again a very complicated question. I mean, if you're a nurse, for example, there's people often suffer from compassion fatigue, which is the sense in which you can't care for everybody in the same way, in that sense, because it would just destroy you if you're treating people who are very unwell or dying. There's a way in which your emotions have to be performed, right? But at the same time, you have this expectation, and it's particularly terrible for nursing, I think, that somehow they're doing this out of the goodness of their heart. Like, this is something